Hi everybody, hey, welcome back. This is Mr. Forrest here. I'm going to do a little bit of a review for Chapter 2 this time, okay? So Chapter 2, let me go ahead and share my screen. There we go. Go ahead and do this. Okay, now you see my desktop screen. And I want to go ahead and launch CMD, so I'm going to come down to my search option and type in Command CMD, press Enter. And then again, I need to reacquire this, so I'm going to stop the share and reshare. There we go. Okay, now we have the access to this one here, and I'm just going to go ahead and maximize. So here's my, remember my command line interface and stuff for Microsoft Windows, whatever version of Windows that you are using. There's my default system prompt right now. That's the one that goes back to on my particular computers. Yours will be very similar, okay? And we can kind of get into the basic elements of what would be in the commands, okay? So I hope that kind of helps here, at least initially. When I look at Chapter 2, now Chapter 2 is going to build off of obviously Chapter 1, okay, you know, and it's going to want to give you some, again, some base knowledge of what it is that you're trying to accomplish, okay, and so in this case, it's going to want to talk about the system prompt again, okay. Again, if I read this from right to left, this would say that the little arrow, just a separator saying separating the system prompt from any commands that I typed, that I am currently residing in the Mark folder. The Mark folder, which is located where? It's located under the users folder off of the root directory of drive C. So again, drives are established by letters and colons, okay? And if I have a drive D, I would put in D colon, press enter, oh, not there. And E colon, press enter, oh, not there. And I colon, enter, oh, I do have something there. And then this would tell me that, hey, there's my separator arrow. I'm at the root directory of drive I colon, okay? And so when we look at the various drives and stuff, you know, one of the things that we come across are what are the, what is the default location, including the default drive location, okay? Now, you know, one of the things this chapter is going to begin talking about and stuff are the syntax of a command and talk about whether or not it has any kind of parameters, okay, which is some kind of piece of information and stuff that you want to include in the command, and that you have delimiters, which indicates where the beginning or the end of a command is, okay? Any kind of requirements to a command, as well as any kind of options for a command, okay? And if you remember from the review from the first chapter, if we wanted to look at dir, I just typed a dir, if I don't tell it anything else other than dir, it has to give me the directory of the default location, which right now I'm looking at drive I's root directory, and it's giving me all that information, okay? Oh my gosh, there's a whole bunch of it, right? Okay. So I can clear the screen, CLS, and then let's say that I go back to drive C, C colon, enter, and I do a dir, and now I see the dir of the marks folder of users off the root of drive C. So you kind of get an idea of how the dir is going to work, okay? Now also, if you remember from last chapter and stuff, I could do a / question mark, dir /, which is an option, question mark, which means give me help on the dir command, okay? Now the first thing it's going to give me is the basic syntax. That's what this line is here. The basic syntax of a command. It tells me this is the dir command that you could type in just dir by itself. Everything that's in brackets is optional. You notice that everything is in optional because you could type in dir by its lonesome, or you can type in dir with a combination of these switches, okay? And you could have multiple ones if you want, but you could put a dir space drive letter. So dir space C colon, dir place I colon, or whatever location it's at. You can do a default location of dir, say I colon, and the path root directory, /, or /data, or /data, you know, memo doc or something like that, the name of a file, okay? And then again, here's a list of the different switches that are going to go through. And I'm not going to go through all those switches and stuff. I think you guys could read about them and get a comfortable feel, okay? But again, the syntax of a command does what? It shows you what the command is and its options or its various switches. Switches sometimes are called an option, sometimes they're called a switch, sometimes they're called a parameter. And the way you access them is you notice that they're all /. just like the one I used here, I used a /question mark to give me some help on this particular command. Okay, so those are options that are there. Okay, and I can get more specific as I go through this, but right now, you guys, for chapter 2 and stuff, you want to just keep playing, you know, with some of these things. You want to sit there and say, okay, if I do a directory, dir, of where I'm at, you know, let me clear the screen again, CLS, and then do a directory. I see that there's a folder called desktop, so I can type in dir space C:\desktop, and now I get the information of desktop, DESKTOP. Oh wait, it doesn't show me anything. Why? Because desktop is not by itself off the root directory that I just typed. Desktop is under the mark folder, which is under the C folder or user folder, which is off the root directory of drive C. So if I really want to do that, I have to say dir space C:\users\mark\desktop. And now I get that answer. So here, see, look, it's got the full path, what we call the full path here. So I was able to do a command that says directory of C:\users\mark\desktop, and the response to that command was there's no volume label, whatever, label just being a name, there's the serial number, and then it repeats the directory of what I just requested, and then it shows me the results of that, okay? So I hope that kind of helps a little bit about utilizing the command with a particular switch, okay? Now, again, this chapter is going to make these reference of using these various drive letters. It's going to talk about printers a bit. Now, redirecting output to PRN, okay, or LPT1, a line print terminal, okay, are older features that are not used as often, okay? So some of it may or may not work on your home computer and stuff, but understanding that I could take a file, and instead of having it print to the screen in front of me, the monitor, I could have it redirected and redirect to a print on the printer, okay, rather than print on the screen, okay? Anyway, so again, what did I say again? I said the first backslash over here is what's called the root directory, which is your main primary directory, okay? And that switches that we add, like we did before here for dir, or time or date, whatever, have a / option, okay? Just like the /question mark, okay? And that directories are divided up, okay? And that subdirectories have names. So if I want to make, and we're going to get to the making of these kind of directories, but right now I can use, just real quick, the change directory command. So right now I'm in the mark directory, but what if I want to get to the users directory? I can say cd change directory space \users. Now press enter, and it says, okay, look, my system prompt changed to the users, okay? Now, some of us might have said, well, shouldn't I just simply do cd space C:\users, right? Gets me to the same answer. So that's the full path, right, if I were to do it that way. Either way, notice my system prompt is now different. I'm no longer sitting in the mark folder, I'm now sitting in the users folder, because that's what a change directory did. And if I did dir without any specifics, what is it going to give me the answer to? It's going to give me the answer of what's in the users folder now. That's those folders, that's files, okay? Let me clear the screen. Okay, well, there we go. What if I want to go to the root directory? I would say cd / change directory to the root, okay? Now I'm at the root directory of drive C, and that's the highest directory. There are no other directories higher than the root. And if I go dir there without giving an answer, remember it wasn't more specific, I'm using the general. It says, oh, these are the folders that are in the root directory of drive C. So you kind of get the idea of how you can use a change directory command, cd, to change from various folder locations, okay? Let me again, if I were to go to drive I:, my student activities disk, and do a dir, I'm at the root directory of drive I, and I see all of these files out here because they have file names and byte sizes and things like that. And then, oh, I have some that have folders, the data folder, level 1, media, and so on. If I want to change into that folder, that subdirectory, okay, then let's say I want to change into this music one, I would say cd \music, right? Great. Now my system prompt says you are now sitting in the music folder off of the root directory of drive I:. So if I type in dir, I can say, oh, look, these are all the different files that are associated with it. Now you get the idea of how I'm using the student activity disk to practice and play with, and that if we all use the student activity disk, then we should be able to come up with, say, all the same answers. So for instance, I have two files that are called Ballad 1960 and Ballad 1960 Hits, okay? They both begin with the letter B, okay? If I wanted to have a listing, a direct listing of all files that begin with the letter B, I would type in dir space B followed by what we call a wildcard. Now there's two types of wildcards. There's an asterisk that can represent one or many characters, or there's a question mark that can only represent one character, okay? I'm gonna find this more useful right now if I use the asterisk. So that's your multiplication or your star, okay? So if I typed in dir space B star and press enter, it says, look, I have two B files. Well, let's try that again with I can see two C tries, so files that begin with the letter C. So I'm gonna say dir space C star, okay? And now it says, oh, you have these two, okay? Well, what about D? Well, D, I got a bunch of doo-wops, okay? So if I come back here, dir space D star, and that says, oh, you have a total of 6 files that begin with the letter D. Okay, so that's the first beginning of using the wildcards that will become more and more handy as you kind of go along. Okay, again, I'm in the music folder of drive C. So if I just typed in dir by itself, that shows me a listing of all files and folders. Now, it happens that the default when this activities disk was created for this folder is it looks like it has put it in alphabetical order, right? See, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, R, S, T. Okay, yeah, it's in that right order, okay? But I could change the order of the directory listing just temporarily by saying, okay, what are the options? dir / question mark for help. Okay, ooh, I can sit there and say the order of something, okay, is an option sort order, okay, /O. And then I can tell it by extension, by size, by dates, by times, by names. And I can use the dash to have a reverse order, ascending versus descending, okay? So for instance, if I want to sort this by size, then up here, if you notice, remember, it's still in alphabetical order, but I see a bunch of byte sizes here, okay, for how big the files are. So let me do this, okay? I'm going to type in dir by itself. Got it. Now I'm going to type in dir /OS. Now, if you look and compare these two, this one is alphabetical. This one's not alphabetical. This one is sorted by size. See how the numbers go up in numbers? Got it. That's because I put a dir / a switch OS. Okay. Now what I could do is do a dir /O -S. Okay. And now I have the same files, but it's in descending order. This is the ascending one without the dash in front of that command. And this is the descending one that says now it's from highest to lowest, okay? One last thing is that when you're typing a command like dir with a switch, Microsoft was pretty flexible. It didn't make it case sensitive, so it doesn't matter if it's uppercase D or lowercase d for dir or whatever. And it will allow you to put a space between the command and the switch. So if I said dir space /OS, it would still give me the right answer, okay? So that becomes a question. It can even allow you to put multiple commands or switches on the same file, and it just executes them as it encounters them from left to right. So that's the basics and stuff of the Chapter 2 review. I hope that's kind of been helpful as you go through and you read, and then you start working on your homework assignments. And again, remember with the student activities disk being in your USB stick, when you get to those questions at the end of that chapter and stuff that are the problem set ones, we want everybody who is in the class and stuff to use the activity disk off that USB stick that you created, okay? So that this way, if we said, hey, put the listing in, descending order of size for the musics folder, okay, so I can see what it is, and then tell me what the, say the 5th file name is. You say, oh, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, jazzevans.txt. That's maybe, remember, it's in the form of a multiple choice question. Jazzevans.txt might be answer D or something like that, okay? And this way we're all pointing to the same data because we all have the same USB activity disk, okay? Anyway, so I hope that helps. That gives you kind of a bit of an insight. Let me go ahead and stop this recording and stop the share. So have a great one.